Good morning, shalom, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the Justice Talks webinar series presented by Justice for All Canada. As we gather here today, let us acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We honor and respect the First Nations and Métis ancestors who have inhabited this land and reaffirm our relationship with one another. I'm your host, Tazeen Hassan, Advocacy Manager for the Canadian West region at Justice for All Canada. Justice for All Canada is an esteemed human rights organization holding consultancy status at United Nations. Our mission is to combat the genocide and the indigenous nations and the persecution of minorities across the globe. At Justice for All Canada, we are actively engaged in various impactful human rights campaigns. Some examples include Save Our Kashmir Action, Save India from Fascism, Save Uyghurs, Burma Task Force, and Sri Lankan Task Force initiatives. One of our significant campaigns is Prisoner of Conscience campaign. Besides other prisoners, it is also focused on advocating for the rights of Palestinian children detained under the Israeli military detention. Today, our discussion will revolve around the lives of the Palestinians living in the occupied territories of the West Bank. Our distinguished guest is Asher Robert Kirchner, a member of the Steering Committee of Independent Jewish Voices. Asher is also the co-founder of the Reformed Jews for the Human Rights. Based in Edmonton, Asher is the former professor of linguistics at the University of Alberta. In 2022, Asher embarked on 2 trips to the West Bank, Palestine, where he lived with Palestinian families. Throughout his initial visit, he immersed himself in the daily lives of Palestinians for 3 months, accompanying Palestinian children to school. This first-hand encounter allowed him to witness the obstacles they encountered in the occupied territories as a result of the settlement expansions. An internationally recognized war crime, Asher also witnessed a night raid of the Israeli military in a West Bank village. Today, he's going to share his experiences, observations, and analysis. Welcome, Robert Asher Kirchner.
Thank you very much, Tazeen. So
now we commence.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So I have to set up my screen share here. So let me do that.
Okay, I just want to add that audience won't be able to use the chat box, but they can post their questions in Q&A box. Welcome.
Thank you. So is everyone able to see my title slide now? Is that showing up correctly? I will assume so. Okay. So after retirement a few years ago, I began a deep dive into Jewish learning and observance. And the more I learned, the more I was troubled by a certain disconnect. On one hand, the central message of Jewish teaching is one of justice and compassion. This verse from Exodus is just one example. But on the other hand, I know that serious oppression of Palestinians has been done and continues to be done by the state of Israel, purporting to act in the name of the Jewish people, whom I'm a part of. So I felt a responsibility to join with other Jews in standing up and speaking out clearly in support of Palestinian human rights. When I heard about the Center for Jewish Nonviolence and their 3-month program of accompaniment of vulnerable Palestinians in the West Bank, I knew this was something I had to do. So from February to May of 2022, I was a volunteer activist with CJNV's Project Hinenu, which means here we are in Hebrew, along with a handful of other Jewish volunteers from North America. We were hosted by and worked closely with a number of Palestinian activist partners. Here's a shot of us Hinenu volunteers, along with many of our Palestinian partners. And we stayed in 3 villages between the city of Yatta at the very south edge of the West Bank, an area called Masafar Yatta, which means the agricultural lands of Yatta in Arabic. And here you see circled from right to left the villages of El Khair, Duani, and Susia. I've circled one other village, Tuba, slightly to the south, which will figure in some of the stories I'll be telling you. We stayed in rudimentary dorm-style guest houses. The top middle picture is me sitting on a bunk bed in one of them in El Khair. And you'll see that the housing in these villages, for the most part, was rather makeshift. But this is how the Palestinians of this area are forced to live, because Israel does not recognize these villages and denies the residents building permits. And so any construction they do is deemed illegal and subject to demolition. The one exception is the town of Tuwani. Through superhuman nonviolent resistance campaigns over the last 2 decades, which garnered strong international support, Tuwani was able to build a school, to connect to the electricity grid, and most amazingly, to get approval from the occupation authorities for a certain amount of residential building, relatively protected from demolition. And the house you see in the picture at the bottom right is in Tuwani. You can see it's a well-built structure with a solid wall and a stone staircase leading down into a courtyard. So what did we do while we were there? Well, Tazeen already spoke to a couple of things. First of all, we accompanied children from the village of Tuba to and from school in Tuwani, and that was to protect them from settler attacks. There's supposed to be an army patrol to escort these kids past a nearby, extremely hostile Jewish settlement, but this army patrol sometimes shows up late, or they don't show up at all, and the whole time that the kids are waiting, they're vulnerable to attack. Palestinian adults can't accompany the kids because it's illegal for Palestinians to be, the adults anyway, to be that close to the settlement. So there's still a need for international or Israeli adults to accompany the kids as they wait. In the picture on the left here, you see a couple of us playing soccer with some of the boys on a day when the army showed up several hours late. And here's another clip showing one of us playing patty cake with one of the girls. Another big part of our work was accompaniment of Palestinian shepherds as they led their flocks of sheep and goats out to pasture. Some days were peaceful, but often these shepherds would get harassed or even attacked by settlers. If the shepherds wanted us to, we would then call the army or police when these attacks occurred, and sometimes the authorities showed up and sometimes they didn't, but not once did they arrest a settler. If they intervened at all, it was to order both sides to leave the area and go home, even though the Palestinians were on their own private land. A couple of times, army night raids occurred while we were staying in Tuwani, as Tazeen mentioned. These were not in response to any violence or criminal activity on the part of any of the residents. There was no problem or provocation that needed to be addressed. The army just showed up in the middle of the night in their armored jeeps and roared through the town, throwing out stun grenades randomly and waking everybody up. And the army calls this making their presence felt. On one occasion, soldiers tackled me to the ground to keep me from filming, which I was legally entitled to do. And here's a clip of that encounter.
Give him his phone. I'm with him.
Go, let's
Do not touch me. Do not touch me. Don't touch me. אני יהודי מארצות הברית. אני יהודי. Do not. Do not.
Okay. So I was the one wearing the yellow jacket. I know it's difficult to see. We were filming in the middle of the night, but that was a bit of what happened in that particular occasion. And afterwards, just gratuitously, they threw stun grenades at us. Now, we also witnessed home demolitions. As I mentioned, the homes being subject to demolition whenever the Israeli authorities feel like it. Now, I somehow didn't hang on to any of our demolition images, so I'm using these images that I found online, but I can tell you that this is pretty much what we saw. Our partner Auda summed up the situation that they all live under. He and his family go to sleep every night, not knowing whether or not they will have a home to sleep in the following evening. So just try to imagine what it's like to live with that kind of threat hanging over your head constantly. We also documented the aftermath of a pogrom last March in Tuba, where settlers invaded the village and smashed the windows of all the cars. And when we called the Israeli police, they threatened to arrest us for wasting their time. Now, if you've been following the news, you know that in the past year, these sorts of pogroms have gotten much worse in their level of violence and in their frequency. We've read about Huwara and more recently Turmasaya. And I say this with shame as a Jew. The word pogrom is a Russian word, and it originally was used to describe mob attacks and murders targeting Jewish communities around the turn of the century in Tsarist Russia, orchestrated and encouraged by the Tsarist regime. This wave of terror is probably the reason my great-great-grandparents had to flee Eastern Europe. So that Jewish people with this kind of historical trauma could turn around and do the same thing to another people is horrifying to me. And this is a large part of what motivates me to work to redress the injustice that Palestinians now face. So we forwarded the video evidence that we collected each day to Israeli human rights organizations and to lawyers representing the Palestinians in land claims cases. On the positive side, we formed deep relationships of friendship with our Palestinian activist partners, as well as with the shepherds we accompanied and with the ordinary people of the villages where we stayed. For example, when Auda in El Khair heard that it was Zach's birthday, Zach is one of the people in our party, he quickly organized a birthday party for him. Now, I'd never heard of this technology before, but in the city of Yatta, there is a bakery that can make cakes with a custom image of the birthday boy or girl printed in the icing. Now, Auda somehow got a hold of this picture of Zach, apparently terrorized by killer sheep, or pretending to be anyway. Just a second. Okay, here is Zach at the party with the resulting cake. After the cake was served, we went around the circle offering good wishes to Zach or sharing funny anecdotes about him. And we had many such gatherings during our 3 months there with Palestinians, with Jewish Israelis, and with us American and Canadian Jews, all working, eating, laughing, and grieving together, with conversations weaving back and forth between English, Arabic, and Hebrew. We even celebrated the Jewish holiday of Pesach with our Palestinian partners during in a joint Seder Iftar meal, because it also coincided with the Muslim month of Ramadan. Together, we sang Hine Matov Umanaim, which in English means how good and pleasant it is for brothers and sisters to dwell together in unity. And that's precisely what we were doing. So before these experiences, the word solidarity was just an abstract concept to me, but now it has real emotional content, beautiful and powerful. Now, I wish I could end my presentation on this warm and fuzzy note, but on the very last day of our stay in Masafar Yatta came some very bad news. The Army had designated much of this district as Firing Zone 918, supposedly as a military training area. The firing zone is marked on the map with a yellow border. You can see it down in the bottom right-hand corner. Okay, contemporary internal documents make clear that this decision was not about any real military need, but purely as a stratagem for getting control of Palestinian land in order to turn it over to settlers. In 1999, the army expelled the residents, but the Israeli High Court at that time granted an interim injunction allowing them to return to their villages pending a final resolution of the case. That precarious state of affairs continued for over 2 decades, but on May 4th, 2022, the final decision was announced, and the High Court completely rejected the villagers' claim, asserting that the Palestinians who had lived there for generations, if not for centuries, were not in fact permanent residents. The army now has the green light to expel the villagers at a moment's notice. But somehow the Jewish settlements within this supposed firing zone are exempt from the expulsion. This seems to be the largest mass expulsion by Israel since the 1967 war. And already the army bulldozers have begun home demolitions, particularly in the southernmost villages closest to the Green Line. And here's a scene from, I believe this is from the village of Jimba, to the south of where we were staying. Now, not all of our Palestinian partners in Masafariyata are directly affected by this ruling. The villages of Al-Khair, Tuwani, and Susia are all just outside of the firing zone, but Tuba is inside it. So the school kids we accompanied every day live inside that firing zone, and likewise, many of the shepherds we accompanied. Well, I'm still going to try to end on a hopeful note. The hope I see in these dark times is in the possibility of Palestinians and Jews standing together for human rights and against the apartheid and ethnic cleansing that we're now seeing. In the midst of the massive anti-Netanyahu protests that continue to rock the Israeli society, there is a block of committed, courageous Jewish activists proclaiming that Jews can't have democracy for themselves while imposing a military dictatorship on Palestinians. Inevitably, the dictatorship will leak back across the Green Line, harming liberal Jews as well. And that's exactly what we've been seeing with the Netanyahu government. Here in Canada, I belong to Independent Jewish Voices, a Jewish organization that supports the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and works to debunk false claims of anti-Semitism that are regularly thrown at the Palestinian Solidarity Movement. The leadership of the resistance movement, I believe, needs to be firmly in Palestinian hands because they're the ones whose lives are on the line. But I think Jews can be crucial allies in this struggle, showing the world that this is not some kind of cage match, Jews versus Palestinians, where one side winning means the other side has to lose. This is about Jews and Palestinians and other allies coming together, standing up for human rights. If we can overcome the vicious, un-Jewish ideology of Jewish supremacy in Israel-Palestine, Jews and Palestinians, I believe, will both be winners. And the same goes for the ideology of white supremacy and settler colonialism here in Canada. Thank you. That concludes my presentation, and I've just included a few websites in the final slide here. I particularly encourage you to check out 972mag.com if you're not familiar with it already. It's an excellent source of news from the ground in Israel, Palestine, and many of the Palestinian partners that we worked with regularly write for that news magazine. I should also mention a small group that I and a few other people are in the process of forming called Reform Jews for Human Rights. So Jews come in different flavors. I'm a Reform Jew, and I'm trying to organize within the Reform Jewish movement for people who say they support human rights for everybody to show that they really mean it for Palestinians as well. And I'll also just mention CJPME, that's Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East. This is not a Jewish organization, but is open to any Canadians who are interested and want to work for peace and justice for Palestinians. Thank you. And I'm now happy to entertain any questions.